All right, got another date here that's kind of important to understand. The Quebec Act is installed in 1774. In 1775, the U.S. Revolutionary War starts. Um, and as a result of that, like, we're not going to sort of talk a lot about that war. That's not important. But as a result of that war, there's about 10,000 people who move from the United States up to Canada. And they move because they didn't want to be American. They wanted to be British, and they were loyal to the British Crown. So they moved north to what was the remaining sort of British colony in North America, and were given land and that sort of thing. However, there's only 10,000 of them. And the Francophone population of North America has had 100 years to sort of establish itself and intermarry with the indigenous population, and also 100 years of, intentional importing of people from Europe. So what that means is that as they arrive, these loyalists coming to what they wanted to be a British colony wind up being in the minority because there are more Francophones, there are more Catholics, and that is not the experience they really wanted, right? They didn't want to move to France, they wanted to move to Britain, right? They wanted sort of a British society. And the response to this is kind of an attempt, and we'll sort of get into this a little bit, but it's an attempt, an unsuccessful one, to sort of manage these tensions. So the idea, the way that the British Crown attempts to solve this is the Constitution Act of 1791. And what they do in that sort of space is they split the colony that is sort of Quebec, I guess, into two. So you create Upper Canada and you create Lower Canada. And Upper Canada is roughly analogous to what is now Ontario, and Lower Canada is roughly analogous to what is now Quebec. And that is an attempt to deal with those tensions, right? So they split them into two separate colonies so that you could have, for example, an Anglophone Upper Canada and a Francophone Lower Canada. And that's an attempt to minimize those sort of tensions, those linguistic and religious tensions. What it actually winds up doing is creating an absolutely perfectly enshrined legislated way of ensuring that those tensions continue. However, we'll sort of talk about that a little bit as we sort of go through. This is a big part of Canada's constitutional history, actually, is that creation of Upper and Lower Canada. So we divide this line. And one of the things that happens in that process is to create elected legislative bodies in both places. So there is a sort of democratically elected body in both Upper Canada and Lower Canada. It's really important to understand, though, that those elected bodies do not do what you think they are doing because they don't do what they would do today. Okay, so if we talk about an elected government body in a contemporary context, an elected body decides what the projects are going to be, what the government is going to spend money on, how we're going to raise that money. So they just make decisions about both taxes and spending, okay? In 1791, those powers are split. So what is essentially happening is this idea that the British Crown is going to give you a bill as the Legislative Assembly. You're the Legislative Assembly, you're going to get a bill. And here it's going to give you a list of, like, this is what kind of money we want you to have. And as the Legislative Assembly, you do not get to contest that bill, okay? You just get to decide how we're going to raise it. So what you wind up with is people being elected to collect taxes that they don't get a chance to decide how they're spent, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like later on. I just want you guys to understand that this is a legislative body created in 1791, that sort of Upper and Lower Canada divide is created in 1791, but it doesn't have a lot of power. It really, 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 really doesn't, okay? So that's sort of this process of loyalist immigration, and it really does, again, sort of reproduce that shift that we saw with the habitants and the voyageurs, in that it reproduces this split because now you, again, have two groups living relatively close together who have very different ideas about what society ought to be. And I understand, for those of you, I know I have a lot of you in this class who are like, I really want to learn about Indigenous history. I understand that there are a lot more than two groups in this environment and in this geographical space. We are 100% going to get to that. However, when we talk about the idea of political representation in the 1790s, Indigenous people are a non-starter, right? They don't participate in the democratic decision making for the most part, and they don't, like, their opinions are simply not taken into account. So what we have is two political entities that are sort of struggling. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the only groups that are sort of interested in this. I just sort of feel I need to put in that disclaimer because it's really easy to tell this story without a recognition that we have, for example, an Indigenous population that is wholesale kind of avoiding this whole, that is wholesale excluded from this sort of process.